We had a technical interruption just then. I was talking about Steve Mnuchin and whether he is being clear and telling the truth about the ways in which Donald Trump and his administration are viewing economic policy and the budget policy. We don't know yet what is going to come out of that budget policy, but we do know that there seem to be a lot of magic asterisks in terms of trying to increase dramatically the military budget and fulfill a lot of obligations and promises on infrastructure, for example, without touching Social Security and Medicare, getting cuts in places like foreign aid, which are such a tiny proportion of the federal budget that they couldn't begin to cover the budget deficit created by a 10% increase in military spending. So there are lies all over the place. And again, these are not small lies. Jeffrey Sessions lied about not meeting with Russian agents. He tried to spin it this way. He said, well, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, he had different business with regard to the Russian ambassador and perhaps other Russians, other than the campaign, other than inquiries into and pertinent issues surrounding what may have been Russian intervention into the campaign on Trump's behalf, perhaps with the collaboration of Sessions and other Trump aides. We don't know, but it makes no sense to assume that Jeff Sessions was meeting with Russian officials around and on the subject of armed services when, in fact, no other Armed Services Committee members were doing so. Why would Jeff Sessions take it upon himself to do that for no apparent reason? It had to be Trump campaign matters. And if he was so innocent of doing any wrongdoing, why would he have lied to the committee twice when committee members asked him about his connections and if he had any meetings with the Russians? He could have said, if he was innocent, he could have said, well, yes, well, I did meet with the Russian ambassador twice, but I met with the Russian ambassador about matters that had nothing to do with the Trump campaign. He could have said that if that was the truth, but he chose not to. Now that in Washington parlance and in Washington history is known as a cover-up. Now, raising the stakes in all of this is a report in yesterday's Wall Street Journal that U.S. counterintelligence officials have been looking into contacts that Sessions may have had with Russian officials during the spring and summer. This is long before those two contacts that he has finally conceded he did have. And what were those about? In fact, it's becoming more and more a topic in the news in Washington as more and more people associated with Donald Trump and with the Trump campaign continue to come under investigation because of contacts that they had, and many of them admit these contacts, with Russian agents or Russian officials. Paul Manafort, a former campaign manager for Donald Trump, Michael Cohen, his personal lawyer, Roger Stone, a political associate of Donald Trump, Carter Page, a former policy advisor and associate of Donald Trump, Michael Flynn, a former policy advisor, briefly national security advisor for Donald Trump, Jeff Sessions, as we've just been talking about, J.D. Gordon, a Trump advisor, whose name has not really been in the news lately, but recently it appears that he did also have contacts with Russian agents, Russian officials, and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and one of his chief White House advisors. The list gets longer and longer. What did they do? Why do so many of these people, was it necessary for so many of these people to meet with so many Russian agents or operatives or the Russian ambassador? What's going on here? No transition in history has ever had that many meetings with Russia. I was in charge of the economic transition for Bill Clinton's administration in 1992, 1993. I never had any inkling that anyone, certainly not me or anybody I knew, ever met with any Russians during the Clinton transition. What's the purpose of meeting with all of these Russians unless it has something to do with Russia's participation in the 2016 presidential campaign? That's the point. That's the problem. That's what the investigations have got to uncover, or at least settle. We need to know about this, and it shouldn't be a partisan issue. The more Democrats demand more information and the more Republicans stonewall, the more it looks like a cover-up, but it also looks partisan, and it should not be. We all have a deep, abiding, powerful interest in the integrity of our electoral system. Now, in addition to all of this, we have the question of whether Jeff Sessions' recusal from the investigation is enough. You recall yesterday he decided to recuse himself. He was asked to recuse himself far long before this. In fact, even beginning with his confirmation hearings. Will you recuse yourself from the FBI investigation? Because the FBI obviously reports to the Attorney General. He said no. Well, finally, when the pressure mounted in the wake of these revelations about his contacts with the Soviet ambassador, the Russian ambassador rather, Jeff Sessions said he would recuse himself from the investigation. But here's the problem. He lied with regard to the confirmation hearing. He lied about contacts with the Russians. He lied under oath. Why should we believe that he will recuse himself and not review or in any way participate in the FBI investigation of what may have transpired between Russia and the Trump campaign? He was a major player in the Trump campaign. This investigation is going to be investigating him. How can we trust that he will recuse himself? Now, this is the essence of the problem. You've got James Comey, who is the head of the FBI. People reporting to James Comey. James Comey himself is not somebody who has a complete lack of interest or has displayed complete nonpartisanship with regard to these kinds of questions, because he arguably did intervene and interfere in the campaign with regard to his selective use of leaks, James Comey. And James Comey is going to be reporting to the new acting Attorney General. But that acting Attorney General, Dana Boente, that acting Attorney General does nevertheless still report to Jeffrey Sessions, as long as he's going to be Attorney General. And the Attorney General reports to, invariably, the President, Donald Trump. So as long as you have people investigating people who are their superiors, you are going to have, naturally, a disinclination to investigate quite as hard or as powerfully and robustly as the investigation needs to occur. Which gets me to the final point of all of this, and that is we need to have Dana Boente, who is the acting Deputy Attorney General, now in charge of overseeing the FBI's investigation. We need Dana Boente to appoint an independent special prosecutor, a special counsel, to conduct and lead this investigation. Now, the Department of Justice has regulations on the books, Department of Justice regulations. If you can look for them, it's 28 CFR 600.1.1. Now, these regulations say the Attorney General or the acting Attorney General should appoint an outside special counsel if it's determined that it would be in the public interest and that in not doing so would, quote, present a conflict of interest for the department or other extraordinary circumstances. Well, here we have a patent conflict of interest for the department and extraordinary circumstances, because the investigation would be an investigation of the Attorney General and the President of the United States. You can't do that investigation using people who are in the line of command. And so you have to have, and that's why you have this regulation, you have to have an outside special counsel. Now let me just say, in terms of lies, there is another big lie that's being perpetrated by Donald Trump, having nothing whatever to do with Russia or Russian intervention in the campaign, but it is as mischievous in terms of public policy making, and we heard it again this week in Donald Trump's address to a joint session of Congress. He said that corporations need tax cuts and regulatory relief. Why do they need tax cuts and regulatory relief? Scott Pruitt, the administrator of the EPA, said the same thing yesterday and even again this morning when he was justifying getting rid of some EPA regulations. They are necessary, he said, because corporations need relief from these burdens. Now, why exactly do corporations need relief, tax relief and also regulatory relief? It would be one thing if corporations in the United States were hurting, if their profits were down, if they couldn't make investments, if they really were in bad shape, maybe then there would be an argument for some sort of regulatory relief and tax relief. But here's something that Donald Trump doesn't say, Republicans don't talk about at all, and I wish the press would report on a little bit in terms of giving you some context for understanding this argument. Corporate profits are now at their highest level relative to the size of the U.S. economy since the government began keeping records on corporate profits in 1947. Let me repeat that again because it's worth getting into your head and spreading the truth so you can understand why all this blather about corporate tax cuts being necessary in order that American corporations be competitive and also that regulations be eliminated so that American corporations can have the burden of regulations taken off them. The fact is that corporate profits for U.S. companies are now at the highest level as a percentage of the total economy than they have been since 1947. Corporate profits are more than twice as high now as they were at their peak before during the Ronald Reagan administration. They're more than 50% higher than during the late 1990s internet boom when the stock market soared relative to the size of the economy. In other words, there is no problem with regard to corporate profits. There's no problem with regard to corporate competitiveness, the competitiveness of United States corporations. There is no reason in the world to sacrifice regulations that protect us from the consequences of global climate change, that protect us as consumers, as investors, that protect workers and workers' safety. There is no justification for rolling back these regulations. Dodd-Frank, that will prevent or is designed to prevent another too-big-to-fail meltdown of Wall Street. Why is it necessary to get rid of these regulations and to also grant corporations this gigantic tax relief? They don't need it. American corporations are now parking over $2 trillion abroad they don't even know what to do with. They're buying back shares of their own corporations in order to raise share prices because they don't want to invest. Why don't they want to invest? They don't want to invest because American consumers are not buying enough to justify additional investments. And American consumers are not buying enough to justify additional investments because American consumers, in terms of the middle class and the working class and the poor, are not getting enough income as a proportion of the total economy to justify those corporate investments. In other words, instead of giving them tax cuts and regulatory relief that are going to make the budget even more stringent for working Americans who need a variety of government benefits, including unemployment insurance and other things, what we ought to be doing is actually building the middle class, building opportunities for the poor, better jobs that pay better wages, And then there'd be enough aggregate demand for companies to make investments. But the direction the Republicans and the Trump administration are now taking, talking about the necessity of increasing corporate profits by reducing corporate taxes and reducing regulations, makes no sense whatsoever. It is just like Trump's foreign policy and many other issues we are now trying to deal with as a country based on a tissue of lies. You need to know the truth. You need to spread the truth. And by the way, I want to commend all of you for your continued efforts to be citizen activists, to hold politicians, starting with Donald Trump, accountable. Many of you write me and you tell me you're pretty exhausted right now. I was pretty exhausted. I had to take a few days off last week. But I can tell you that behind and beside the exhaustion that many of you feel after almost 6 weeks of Donald Trump, there is also the deep and abiding importance of standing up to this. Standing up to these moves by Trump and others that are lies, moves that continue to denigrate the press, the free press, and also object to the courts when the courts don't do what Donald Trump wants. Standing up to this kind of authoritarianism in favor of democracy is not and should not be a partisan issue. I call on every Republican, and please join me in calling on any Republican you know to join the resistance. That is the end of tonight's Resistance Report. I hope you have a very, very good and relaxing weekend, and I'll see you next week.